I want to thank Rick Davis. I reached out to him a week ago and said, hey, I have a lot of people asking basic questions about asset protection and creating an LLC or whatever, and that are very misinformed. So could you give us a quick mini workshop at the meeting tonight? And so I don't know if you have a screen you wanted to share, Rick?
There we go. All right, so
work.
As Kim said, I am a lawyer here in Kansas City. I've been working with real estate investors almost exclusively for a little over 5 years. The one thing that hadn't fully been announced yet, but it just started to roll out, is that as of last week, I soft opened my new company, which is Rick Davis Real Estate, which is essentially a company geared specifically for real estate investors. And so the vast majority of my clients have always been real estate investors. I wanted to really hone in on that. Just a very quick overview so you know who I am, for those of you who I haven't met or spoken with before. The 4 components of this new company are essentially the law firm that I've always had, legal services, a brokerage geared specifically for dealing with real estate investors and investors, a title company for the same purpose, and then I also do my own investing. All right, so let's get on to the topic here, asset protection. And so I thought I'd kind of start with a very basic question, and I think Kim did a great job of leading in, as she always does. This is going to be kind of basic. You know, it's not going to get a whole lot into the nuts and bolts, but kind of an overview with some concepts and some things to think about. So we'll start with that first question, which what is asset protection? And it's this idea of the things that you can do to help minimize your risk. You can never eliminate risk, but you can minimize it. And so what that means is if someone wants to sue you for some reason, if something happened with one of your investment properties, what are the ways that you can try to make that hurt as little as possible, right? What isn't asset protection, though, is also equally important to think about. And I kind of put that at the bottom of the screen, which is nothing that you can do can prevent someone from suing you. And so, you know, I think a lot of times when people think, and the most common question to asset protection is, I'm going to form an LLC, and we're going to talk about that in a second, but is the thought, well, I'm going to form an LLC and then I can't be sued. Well, that's not true. You can still be sued. But these are the ways to kind of minimize the risk if that happens. And I should also, as I say that too, when I say nothing can prevent someone from suing you, I say that because literally there is no one at the courthouse that reviews what's filed. So someone who's never met you, never talked to you, could go file a suit against you, even when you've done nothing wrong. So that's why it's always important to think about the ways that you can kind of protect yourself when it comes to those type of claims. And so I think it's kind of a good lead in here, is I get this question a lot, and as we kind of start with these basic questions, is most people, like I mentioned a moment ago, when they're thinking about asset protection, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, I'm going to form an LLC. And there are many ways to do that. You can go on, you can hire a local attorney who helps you set it up. You can go on to LegalZoom. You can hire one of the national companies. You can do it yourself. And often I get asked that question, well, why would I hire an attorney when I can just do it on LegalZoom for less money? And the answer to that question is really what we're going to get into more here through this next 25 minutes that I'm going to try to talk. And it's the fact that you don't hire an attorney to form an entity. If all you're calling me up for is, I want to form an LLC, it needs to be named this, I don't want to talk about it anymore, well then quite frankly, you're wasting your money. Because the amount of information that I would be required to get from you is the exact same information that you could enter on the Kansas Secretary of State or Missouri Secretary of State or really anywhere in the country Secretary of State's website and form that entity yourself. And that's one of the big reasons too, and I'll kind of talk a little bit as I'm moving quickly here, but about some of the downsides to some of the other options. And so like a LegalZoom or any of those kind of website-based entity formations, I would argue that in almost all of those instances, you are better off just to go to the Secretary of State website yourself, because that's essentially what you're doing through that company, but you're paying them an extra $100 on top of it. You're not getting any advice and guidance on what you're doing. And so again, if you're just calling to file an entity, that's usually not where you're going to get your value. You can do that. You can form your own EIN. All those things are just online forms. But where you really get the value from coming to an attorney when it talk about entity formation, asset protection, is twofold. And the first is kind of this idea, which we're not going to talk a lot about today, but is the operating agreement. If there's just one of you and you're doing your own investments, then your operating agreement is very simple. You could pull it off the internet. It doesn't really matter. If you and your spouse are going to be doing investments together, it gets a little more complicated, because you always got to think, and one of the things we say as lawyers is, we're not here for the marriage, we're here for the divorce. What happens if something goes wrong? So we're going to put that together. And I kind of need to back up a little to the operating agreement is those rules for how the business proceeds, who can make what decisions, what happens when there's ties. But when you get to kind of the more creative deals that a lot of times happen in groups like this, where maybe we're going to have 3 people come together to make something happen. One guy's the sweat. He's the one on the ground. The other guy's the money. And, third guy has the contacts or whatever it might be. And guy could be guy or girl, of course, in any of those roles. That's when it's really important to kind of have the operating agreement. But the other side of when it's important to think about talking to an attorney when it comes to asset form or entity formation is this what we're going to talk about today. And it's asset protection. And so, like I said, if you're just looking to form it, you can go online and do it. But what really you can get from talking with an attorney and talking with someone who works with real estate investors is this idea of what entity is right for me. Is it a series of entities? Is it one? Does it involve a trust? Does it involve LLCs, corporations, all the different things that you might be able to do to think about what's the best way to do it. And so as we kind of delve in here into a little bit more detail, I put up some of these questions that are very common, with the one in the top left being probably the most common legal question asked in every real estate investor group in the United States. And so anyone who's spent any time around kind of investors and legal questions has probably seen that. Should I form one LLC for all my investment properties or one for each property? Other questions that can be kind of similar is, should I form the entity now or wait until later? Is an LLC always the right option? Do I need to have a parent LLC with subsidiaries? These are all these kind of things to think about. And so the unfortunate thing, and it's disappointing, is that I'm not going to be able to just answer any of those questions for you right now, because the answer is the famous attorney words, it depends. And so the reason for that is because really when it comes to protecting your assets and setting up your entity structures and what you're going to do along those lines, I always say that it's a sliding scale. So whenever I talk to somebody, we can always talk about, okay, here is what's going to protect you the most. We put all your properties in separate entities. We separate, maybe we have a parent on top of that to deal with management. I mean, we're going to do a lot of entities. That's going to protect you the most. But it also comes with more headache. You have to make sure to maintain the paperwork for each of these entities. And we're going to talk briefly about some of that in a minute. But, you have to make sure that you're doing things the right way. And so it's always a balancing act of a little bit of what's the best way to protect your assets? How much assets do you have? Versus what are your kind of personal goals and investment strategies and that kind of things. And so here are just some of the main things that I would look at and talk about when I'm trying to talk to someone about what kind of structure I put together. And so, the first of those is the value of your assets. And I want to emphasize that it's the net value of your assets when you're thinking about it. And so if you've got 15 properties, but they're all leveraged to the hill and maybe have $1,000 of net value in each of them, well, and they're net equity, then that may not make a whole lot of sense to put them in 15 different LLCs, because you really only have $15,000 there of risk if someone was to sue you. On the flip side, if you have 2 properties, but they have $500,000 worth of equity sitting in each of them because you've owned them for years, bought them in cash, whatever it might be, well, it might make a lot more sense to put those in 2 different entities, because you have a lot to risk if someone was to sue you for something that happened at one of the 2 properties. And so that's one of the first questions. I always say, too, that the other thing to think about, and really this gets kind of to that question of when do you form your entity, is what other income and assets do you have? And so if you're someone maybe that's straight out of high school, college, you don't have a whole lot in the bank, you're just getting started in investing, an entity in general may not even be all that important to you, because the question is, what are you going to lose if somebody sues you, right? So if all you have is $100 to your name sitting in the bank account and a car that's upside down and an apartment, it may not make sense to form an entity right now because you don't have a whole lot that you're trying to protect. On the flip side, if maybe you're at the end of your career, you have a few $1 million sitting in an investment account or whatever it might be, it might be real important to make sure that we put those layers of protection there for you, because you have a lot of things to make sure that you're protecting. The other question is that risk tolerance. So I mentioned that earlier, and a little bit of this is kind of taking your own personality, and are you the kind of person that's going to go to the casino and, sit at the high roller table or the penny slots? What would you be comfortable losing? And so you're never going to look at 2 people and see the same thing. I might talk to 2 people that both have $1 million in assets, and one of them says, I don't care, I earned it quickly, I could earn it again. And they're not real concerned with protection. And you might talk to another person that, pinches every penny and is like, I don't want to lose anything. And so you've got to think about that kind of within yourself when you think about these structures. And then lastly, and this is one that I don't think enough attorneys talk about, is your personality. What is your personality? Are you an organized person? Are you someone that's always on the run? Because again, in order to make sure that any kind of entity structure that you put together for asset protection protects you, you have to do certain things and make sure that you're operating your business in a certain way, which again, hopefully we'll get to in a moment. But if you're not the type person that can be detail oriented, then 15 LLCs is probably not the right option for you, because you need to make sure you keep your accounting separate, your banking separate, and all of that. And so I'll just kind of quickly show these. This was just to kind of give you an idea of when I think about these things, when I'm talking with someone about putting together an asset protection strategy, an entity strategy, I'm going to ask all of them to complete kind of an intake form. And these are some of the questions that I ask. And so you'll see there's things with how would you rate your risk tolerance, your organizational skills, your record keeping. Here kind of getting to that personal side of preferences. Would you prefer to have something that's easier with less chance of mistakes, or something that protects you the absolute most? And so again, I'm not going to be able, unfortunately, to say, yes, just file an LLC, that's going to protect you. But hopefully this gives everybody a little bit of ammunition to think about on your own too. Where do I fall in these spectrums? Am I someone that is okay with risk and is not very detail oriented, or am I someone that wants no risk and is always going to keep things together? And so those are kind of the big things to think about. Kind of talking over a few more of the kind of big picture questions that come up a lot when it comes to these kind of things. And, one of the things too that I mentioned to Kim when she reached out about a week ago or whatever it was that at the time I was actually kind of looking through and going through a lot of these national companies that sell people with entity formation and kind of some of the strengths and weaknesses of what they do and where they're at. And one of the things that I see all the time and quite often is companies and attorneys that try to sell investors on needing to set up an entity structure that provides you with anonymity. And that is actually probably one of the things I disagree with the most when it comes to these formations. And the reason I'm going to say that is because there is no such thing as true anonymity. If someone has a reason to come after you on a large claim and they hire an attorney, we can find out who owns that LLC. We will get there. It may take a little more work. If you have it under 3 layers and a trust involved and all of that, it's going to take us a little longer to get there, but we're going to get there. All that the attempt to kind of make your entities anonymous does, it might help avoid some smaller claims, some pro se parties or something like that, or someone that maybe only has a claim for $10,000. But it's not really going to protect you against those big claims. Because again, if someone wants to find it, they will. Kind of along that same lines is the question that comes up a lot is, should you form your entity in Wyoming, Nevada, Delaware, any other state, fill in the blank? And again, the answer is always it depends. And I'm not going to say that you never should. But I'm also going to say something that's a little contradictory to, I think, what sometimes you hear, especially from the national people, in that, especially for real estate investing, I think the value in it is quite often diminished and not worth the extra hassle and expense. One of the main reasons I would say that is anytime you own real estate within a state, you're going to have to register it as a foreign entity anyway. So if you go up and you set up a Wyoming LLC, for example, you're going to have to register it in Wyoming. Then you're going to have a local entity here, or register a foreign entity here where you actually own the property. Not everybody does that, but if you're going to comply with the law, you need to. That means you now have double the expense for registered agents, double the expense for formation, double the paperwork to make sure it gets filed every year, and just all of these kind of things. The other thing is a lot of times the protections that they're selling you on are already present in our laws. And so one great example that I have, and I took off, although some people on here may know what company this is, but this is a national LLC formation company. I took a little screenshots from their website, and one of the things that they sell you on is their program where essentially they're going to make certificates to your LLC that there's intangible property that they're going to hold in Wyoming for you, with the argument that that would make sure that the LLC gets the protections of Wyoming law. Well, first I want to say one kind of important point to that is that usually the state of formation actually has more to do with the laws that regulate the different members. So if there was a lawsuit between the members, that's really where a lot of times the state of formation comes in. If an action or an activity takes place here in Missouri, Wyoming law may not apply. You may still be dealing with Missouri law. But what this concept here that they're trying to sell people on is to apply the collections law. So this is after the judgment has been entered of Wyoming, where they only allow a charging lien against an LLC. And so what that means is that instead of being able to come in and force you to take money out of your business, they can just have a right to any money that you do distribute. And so it provides some more protection to the owners of the business. And like any business, they charge you for this service. It's $95 to set it up, and it looks like $75 a year. So, almost $200 to let that run. Well, what I'm going to tell everybody here is that Kansas has the exact same charging lien provisions as Wyoming. And so, you can avoid that $175 plus the cost of forming 2 entities, plus the registered agent service, which isn't listed on here, by just forming your entity in Kansas, and you get that same charging lien protection. All right, so last couple topics, and again, I know I'm going kind of quickly here as very global, but I wanted to make sure to talk about this because I think it's also one of the most important things to make people understand, which is, once your LLC is formed, is that it? I formed an LLC. I'm now John Smith LLC. That's who owns the properties. I'm protected. Nothing else I need to do. Well, no, that's not correct. Once you form the LLC there, it's not that complicated. Specifically, if it's an LLC, corporations can be a little more complicated, or trust or different entities. But the important thing, regardless of whatever the entity is that you choose, is that you treat it the way it is. And so the reason that you get protection by using different entities is because the law will view that entity as something separate and distinct from you. So John Smith is a person, John Smith LLC is a essentially fictitious person or a separate entity. And so that way, if someone sues John Smith LLC, they can get to whatever John Smith LLC owns, but not to what John Smith owns, because they are two separate people. But to do this, you have to make sure that you treat John Smith LLC as a separate person, as a separate entity. And if you don't, that's one of the biggest ways that you can end up still being personally liable. And so I had just a couple kind of quick things to think about, with the two at the top being the most important. The first one is bank accounts. Company money is company money. Personal money is personal money. And so whenever you're going to form any kind of entity or any structure that involves multiple entities, each entity has to have its own bank accounts. And so that is something that you need to be very careful with. You can put your money into it and contribute to the business. You can make withdrawals and make money from the business, but you have to make sure that you treat it properly. And so one of the things that I even tell people that meet with me in my office is, maybe you have mobile online banking, for example, and you're sitting there at Home Depot and you're about to make that purchase for the rehab that you're working on. And you go, oh crud, John Smith LLC doesn't have enough money sitting in that account. How am I going to handle this? I need to purchase it. Well, what you don't want to do, and what people sometimes do, investors, is just use John Smith's credit card or debit card and pay for that. Because now you're not keeping those two entities separate and treating them as separate entities. But what you can do is get onto that mobile banking on your cell phone right there, transfer the money, and then let John Smith LLC purchase it. And so sometimes it's the little things like that that you want to make sure that you're doing, so that you are respecting the separation between the two. Also, make sure that you use the name. If you're entering into a contract to purchase a property, to hire a contractor, to do whatever it might be, make sure that you use John Smith LLC if that's who's doing that. If you don't, then again, you're not treating it as that separate entity, because John Smith wouldn't go write James Smith on a contract, right? It's that same concept, and that's the good way to think about it. Meeting minutes. That's one thing that comes up from time to time, is what additional record keeping needs to be done with entities. And, with an LLC, there isn't a whole lot of meeting minutes requirements. And I would say that unless you have multiple members, most of the time you don't need to do much. But if you're a corporation, there is. And so that's one thing to keep in mind, that you have to have your annual meeting and take minutes from that meeting. And really this goes to 2 points that I wanted to make here on this transfers and fraud concept. And, is that the other thing you can't do that will get you in trouble is you can't just try to transfer your money out of the LLC because you're about to be sued. So if you get a demand letter from an attorney, or someone calls you and says, hey, we're about to sue your John Smith LLC because of X, Y, and Z, or whatever, someone slipped and fell on the property, or they think you did defective work on a rehab, or whatever it might be, you can't just pull that money out and go, okay, well, now I'm protected, I'm not going to get anything. No, a lot of times the court's going to look at that as fraud. The other thing that I wanted to make sure too, when I mentioned that no asset protection is complete, is that nothing also will protect you from your own actions as well. And so if John Smith LLC, does everything right, keeps his records up to date, puts his contracts in the right place, but then John Smith himself accidentally hurts someone. So maybe it's on the job site and he slips with a nail gun and hits somebody, John Smith still may be personally liable. And so it's just important to kind of think about that. And so I think I'm just about done. I might actually make the 25 minutes. And so, the last thing I wanted to talk about is that, I focused a little bit on kind of the entity formation side, because I think that's where a lot of us go first when it comes to how do I protect my assets. But I want to make the point that that's not the only way, and arguably, in my opinion, is not even the most important or first way that you should make sure to have for your asset protection. So some of the other things to think about is, what kind of insurance coverage do you have? And that's actually what I would argue is first. Because if you think about kind of your entity structure, you're still going to lose something within your entity, right? If someone sues you, and they end up getting a judgment against your entity, you're going to lose whatever's in that entity. But if you have an insurance policy, you're just going to lose whatever your deductible is, right? Plus, not to mention, a lot of times they'll hire attorneys for you, depending on the policy, pay for the legal defense. And so I would never advise anyone to just, I'm going to form some LLCs and that's going to be it. You always want to think about and making sure you have the right insurance in place too. The next one, which is one that, we think about too, is just do things the right way. The best way to avoid being sued, and sometimes you make a mistake, you can't ever avoid it, but let's just try to treat people right. Try to treat people fairly. If you make a mistake, own up to it, fix it, that kind of thing. If you're just yourself, then that's just with you. But if you have other people that work with you, or, you hire employees, then have checklists, have process, have procedures in place. So that way you can make sure that everything is being done the way that it should be done every single time. And that really goes a long way to help avoiding any kind of risk down the road. And then lastly, and I'll wrap up here in the next 90 seconds, is ask questions to professionals. And so, I myself have hired attorneys several times in my life, being an attorney, because I do real estate law and work with real estate investors. And if, for example, I need help with some other area of law, I'm going to reach out to attorneys. I reach out to accountants. I reach out to other professionals and members of this group and others. I would recommend that everybody does that, because I don't know how often when I've gotten involved in litigation cases that had someone just asked that question early on in the process and done things differently, they wouldn't be in the litigation that they're in now. And so just to kind of close in the last bit of little slight self-promotion, I'll say that's one of the things that I'm trying to do with my new real estate company, is provide that opportunity to real estate investors to make sure that they have access to legal questions. That's the side I'm going to help with early on in the process. And so if anyone's interested in that, it's an affordable program that provides the ability to ask quick questions and quick legal questions that come up. I'd recommend you come check out my website, rickdavisrealestate.com, to learn a little bit more if that's something you're interested. And on that note too, I will put up, I don't know if there's a whole lot of substance to these slides, but I do have them uploading right now, and they will be on my website at just rickdavisrealestate.com/MAREI by the end of the meeting if anyone wants to pull them. So.
This mini workshop presented by Mid-America Association of Real Estate Investors, serving real estate professionals in the Kansas City market since 2004. Learn more about our membership, community, networking, education, and advocacy at MAREI.org. And if you found this workshop helpful, please like the video and subscribe to our channel.